ratio is. For instance, this line here that says when a line is divided into two parts and the longer part A divided by the smaller part B, etc. It's hard to follow that. The ratio 1.618 is a good thing just to know from an academic standpoint. So this is the algebraic formula, and again, for an art student that isn't particularly important and probably rather incomprehensible to many of us in the field of art. The illustration at the top, the Greek alphabet letter phi, illustrates this concept of the ratio of A to B and B to C. And again, it's a little hard to understand how that fits into the rectangular format. So we'll move on. There are several ways to arrive at a golden rectangle when you're trying to do a composition based on a rectangle with those dimensions. This is one of the most versatile. If you know the approximate size, in fact, if you know what the short dimension is going to be, draw a square with the short dimension of your rectangle, and then simply swing an arc from the midpoint of one side, where the dotted line is, illustrates the radius of the arc. And really all we're talking about is this section of the arc right here. You're going to construct that arc. Once you've come up to the point directly above this side, you can stop making the arc and simply extend the rectangle to this point, extend this side of the square up, and bring it across to this point, and you have a golden rectangle. A really easy way to construct a golden rectangle of any size you might want, but there are other ways to get there. Before I go there, I want to talk a little bit about this logarithmic spiral, or the spiral created by this golden section, this ratio of 1 to 1.618. The diagrams on the left show sequentially the square, then the arc, and then extending to the arc, and then that spiral superimposed onto it. And I've always been a little bit confused about exactly how you draw that spiral superimposed on top of these rectangles that get increasingly smaller. But it's really quite simple. Starting with the upper left, you make an arc that goes from the lower left to the upper right corner of that square, and then moving to the next illustration to the right, upper right, you go to the upper right square and continue that arc from the upper left corner to the lower right corner, then drop down to the lower right corner of these four diagrams, and also the lower right corner of the subset here. And you're just continuing that arc as you walk it around the different smaller and smaller sections of the golden rectangle. And I guess you understand that this golden rectangle is not infinitely smaller and smaller and smaller. It is infinitely larger and larger and larger. Well, I say infinitely on the small scale. It would be useless once you get to the microscopic level. But it does keep going in and keep expanding out. So what we're seeing here, with any one of these golden rectangles, is the end of another golden rectangle that has a square on top of it, which is, that larger one is the end of another one. Well, so how does this spiral play out in nature? And you can see these four examples, and there are myriads of examples of the golden spiral found in nature. Be really good to watch the Walt Disney production little video called Donald in Math Magic Land. I believe you'll probably be able to find it on the internet. I have a copy I keep in my office. Well, The Fibonacci sequence is actually the foundation for the golden rectangle and the proportions. If you take the sequence of numbers 1, add 1 to it, equals 2, and then you add each adjacent number. So 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, etc., and you just keep going. But once you get to the 3 by 5 format, every two adjacent numbers are a golden rectangle. The largest one depicted here is 89 by 144. The next one would be 144 by whatever the sum of 144 and 89 is. So anyway, that is how it plays out in nature. That end of the pine cone, you can see the spiral, the nautilus shell, the ram's horn, the giant sunflower, and many, many other places. This brings us to the rule of thirds. Most people who've been in art for any length of time understand that the rule of thirds is a simple way to come up with a pleasing composition. You place maybe a vertical object like a tree or your horizon line. It could be 1/3 up or 1/3 down in a rectangle. A tree could be 1/3 in from the right or 1/3 in from the left, or a person could be placed in that location. Any number of ways to use a rule of thirds. Many cameras have actually a grid that you can superimpose in the viewfinder that has the 3 sections, both horizontal and vertical, so you can instantly see the rule of thirds. It's my personal belief that rule of thirds evolved out of this concept of the golden ratio. But it works with any rectangle, well, any, quote, normal rectangle. If you have an elongated rectangle, say 10 inches by 30 inches, take 10 inches off of one end, you don't have a particularly pleasing dominant and subordinate portions. So this squaring off, this happens to be a golden rectangle, but it wouldn't have to be. You take a square out of one side, that leaves you a golden rectangle. Or it leaves you a dominant and a subordinate, and it can go with the dominant on the left, the dominant on the right, the dominant on the top, or the dominant on the bottom. You can see with a horizontal format how 1/3 up could be a nice low horizon line. So an example, this is the rule of thirds applied to a painting that I did back in about 1979 or 1980. That large paint chip on the siding of an old garage that desperately needed to be repainted. That central paint chip is about 1/3 the width of the entire painting, and in from either side. So you can see how it and the paints below it create these axes, or these rather invisible lines, but it divides it into 3 parts. Also, the horizontal line of the siding at the top is about 1/3 down. Now, the one at the bottom is not 1/3 up, but these aren't rules that have to be followed religiously. They are principles of composition. It's a painting I did, an oil painting, and I actually used the Fibonacci sequence to create this golden rectangle, this canvas. It's about 3 feet by 4 feet, roughly. And I used centimeters instead of feet when I measured off the canvas when I created that, so I could use bigger numbers on the Fibonacci sequence. My theory is, and I'm pretty confident I'm at least partially correct, that the larger the numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, the more accurate your golden rectangle will be. So with this painting, just a landscape of an old bayou out north of Searcy, just past the bridge on the north bypass. As you go over the Little Red River, turn left onto a little road, a little highway there that heads off to a beautiful drive up north. If you turn left after you cross the bridge on that little road, and almost immediately around the bend, you'll come to a bridge and this old bayou with the cypress trees. Nice place to photograph. But almost every element in that painting was placed based on the golden rectangle. You can see the dominant square and the subordinate side that houses the tree. And if you flip it the other way, the light shaded areas in the background create another small rectangle, and the square now is created by the darker shade of the trees and the reflections. And it was also subdivided, this section on the left is subdivided with a square and a golden rectangle remaining, as was the one on the right. As you can see here, different ways of subdividing that painting into various golden rectangles. Well, I hope that helps you a little bit, understanding some very simple principles that can be used in a very complex way that can help you solve some composition problems.